In Unit 2.1, we will discuss the three main methods of research. These include the descriptive method, or the description method, which also incorporates case studies, surveys, and observations. It will also include the experimental method, which seeks to determine the relationship between the independent variable and dependent variable. Remember that experimental method focuses on causation, how one variable causes the other. And the last method we'll discuss is the correlational method, which uses statistics to show to what extent does one variable relate to another. Remember, correlation is not causation. The first method of research that we will investigate is the descriptive method. This method is referred to as a description because description is the starting point of any science via easy, simple observations. This is not experimentation or manipulation of subjects in any way. Descriptive method is a basic research method that aims to merely collect data. The first subcategory of the descriptive method is the case study. A case study is an observational technique in which one person is studied in depth in the hope of revealing universal principles. In other words, the lives of an individual, or two individuals for that matter, is studied in depth in its entirety, their entire lives. This may require the study of documents like ancient tablets from the time of Plato, or essays written by the subject of the research, etc. It could also be a biography. Another type of descriptive research is the survey. The survey is a technique for ascertaining the self-reported attitudes or behaviors of people, usually by questioning a representative, random sample of them. Be wary of wording effects and sampling bias. All right. So, for example, if one wanted to research the political ideologies of the country and as to what sports teams is most popular here at CHS, one would just need to simply conduct a survey to determine the results of the popular vote. However, surveys are not all that simple. They must be carefully worded so as not to unintentionally bias or change what would have been the subject's natural response. Because many of you will be conducting surveys for your research projects, let's discuss some of the other validity issues involved in administering a survey. There are many validity concerns when it comes to surveys, the false consensus effect being one of them. This is the tendency to overestimate the extent to which others share our beliefs and behaviors. For example, my wife and I love anchovies. Because we both like them, everyone must like them, right? Or, Stephen believes that the Green Party is the best political party available, and as a result believes that others agree, but are being kept down by the corporate man. This may inspire Stephen to do something foolish on protest of the environmental policies. But in regards to the survey, it can lead to the researcher to unknowingly bias the wording of the survey, which can lead to invalid results. The population is very important to all types of research, not just surveys. The population is the whole group you want to study and describe. For example, in your study or survey, your aim is to determine how many students in your school listen to country music. Your population, or the whole group you want to investigate, therefore, then would be the entire student body of the school. Now, it is impossible to survey or experiment on the entire student population of CHS. All right, that is why researchers use random and representative samples of a larger population. A random sample of the population is a sample that fairly represents a population because each member has an equal chance of inclusion, because each member of the population is just being randomly selected for the sample. For example, if we were to survey only 50 students out of CHS to assess their opinions on country music, an easy way to find a random sample would be to walk down the hall during a passing period and just ask 50 random students to take your survey. A research method is not considered valid unless it is random. If researchers handpick and choose their subjects, they could be invalidating the research by their bias. It could be argued by possibly picking favorable subjects. A representative sample will provide even more validity to your study by providing subjects that are the same proportionate demographic as your population. For example, in a classroom of 30 students in which half the students are male and half are female, a representative sample might include 6 students, 3 being male and 3 being female. it is important to take other demographic information to ensure the most accurate representative sample possible. So, for example, if we have 50% Caucasian students, 30% Asian students, and 20% Hispanic students, then our sample would need to be the 50, 30, 20% breakdown that would reflect the larger population. Well, getting back to the types of descriptive methods, the third and final one being the naturalistic observation. Simply put, this is observing and recording behavior in naturally occurring situations without trying to manipulate or control the situation at all. Sally wants to observe the features of social interactions between the average high school boy, so she observes boys in the hall during passing periods, socializing in their respective groups, and she takes notes. Sally then makes assumptions and can form other hypotheses to test based on these observations. So, for example, in this picture, that's Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall is famous for observing and taking notes on the behavior of chimpanzees and gorillas in the wild. All right. Well, this brings us to our second method of research. The next method is the experimental method. What sets the experimental method apart from the other methods is that it emphasizes manipulation of one or more factors to determine the cause and effect relationship between independent and dependent variables. Experimentation also holds constant controls or other factors for the purpose of manipulation to show cause and effect. Hint, hint. Just like in surveys and the descriptive method have random and representative sampling, and just as correlation methods use statistics to ensure validity, so too does the experimentation method have validity safety nets. The first safety net under the experimental method is the single-blind study. This is an experiment in which information about the test that might lead to bias in the results is concealed from the tester or the subject. Okay? So, for example, the teacher in Milgram's shockbox experiment who was deceived about the purpose of the experiment, or also in the subject of Ash's line test of conformity, who thought that the other participants of the study was deceived into conforming to the group. The single-blind procedure has proven to be quite effective because, again, we're manipulating or we're deceiving one person, the subject or the experimenter. That is the single-blind. Conversely, the double-blind procedure, which is an experimental procedure in which both the researcher participant and the research staff are ignorant about whether the research participants have received a treatment or a placebo. This procedure is more common in experimentation involving drugs or pharmaceuticals. It may help to further explain a placebo, however. But before we do, it's important to note, double-blind procedure, the key feature is that both the researcher and the subject are both blind to who is actually receiving the manipulation. This is done to ensure that both the subject and the researcher's bias does not impact the results. A placebo is an inherent substance or condition that may be administered instead of a presumed active agent, such as a drug, to see if it triggers the effects believed to characterize the active agent. Subjects who are given the placebo are told they are given the actual drug or treatment under experimentation. Often, the mere knowledge of that information can psychologically lead individuals to experience the biological and psychological effects of the drug. This is called the placebo effect. Sometimes it can be useful when it comes to treating patients of depression and anxiety. If these patients' symptoms are dissolved over a period of time after taking the placebos, psychiatrists know then that the issue was purely psychological. If after taking the placebo, the anxiety persists, the problem may be more biological, which would require actual medications. Who receives the placebo and who receives the actual manipulation or treatment is dependent on their condition or group. In the experimental condition or experimental group, the condition of the experiment that exposes participants to the treatment, that is, to one version of the independent variable, or manipulation. In other words, this is the subject, condition, or group that receives manipulation or the actual drug. The control condition or control group is the condition of an experiment that contrasts with the experimental condition and serves as a comparison for evaluating the effect of treatment. So the control condition receives the placebo and no manipulation to gauge the difference between the experimental group who did receive the manipulation or treatment. This manipulation is often referred to as the independent variable. But how do we determine who is placed in which condition? Who receives the treatment or manipulation and who does not? This is determined by random assignment. Like random sampling for a survey, random assignment involves assigning participants to experimental or control conditions by chance, thus minimizing pre-existing differences between those assigned to the different groups. This is an effort to minimize or eliminate bias. Now, what do we call the manipulation that the experimental group receives? In other words, what is the experimental condition? It is called the independent variable. This is the experimental factor that is manipulated, the variable whose effect is being studied. All right? The effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable of the experiment is what is being studied. The dependent variable is the experimental factor that is being measured, the variable that may change in response to the manipulation of the independent variable. Confounding variables are variables often not taken into consideration by the researcher, but can adversely affect the relation or produce a false correlation between the independent and dependent variable. For example, ask me in class and I'll give you one. Social desirability bias is another danger to validity of research. However, it is more applicable to the survey, as it is a tendency to give socially approved answers to questions about oneself, a potential challenge in surveys involving self-reporting. All right. Another threat is the Hawthorne effect, all right, which is the tendency of some people to work harder and perform better when they are participants in an experiment because they know they're in an experiment. All right. So the presence of researchers arouses the subjects to alter their behavior, not the manipulation or independent variable itself. This term actually derived from an experiment at the Hawthorne Electrical Works plant in Chicago. If you remind me in class, I'll tell you about it and show you a fun video. But that concludes for today. See you guys in class.